Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Josef Mengele, infamously known as the Angel of Death, was a man whose descent into cruelty forever etched his name in the annals of history. A medical doctor by training, Mengele's journey from healer to killer is a chilling story of how science can be twisted to serve the most inhumane purposes. Born into a prosperous German family in 1911, Mengele showed early promise in academia, earning degrees in anthropology and medicine. However, his promising career took a dark turn when he embraced the racist ideology of the Nazi regime. In 1943, Mengele arrived at Auschwitz, the largest of the Nazi concentration camps, where he wielded the power of life and death. To those who passed through the camp's gates, Mengele's cold and calculating demeanor would seal their fate. Known for his cruel experiments, particularly on twins, he sought to justify the pseudoscience of eugenics and racial purity. Yet, his legacy does not end at Auschwitz. After the war, Mengele escaped justice and lived as a fugitive in South America, evading capture despite an international manhunt. This documentary explores Josef Mengele's chilling transformation, his heinous acts, and his life after the Holocaust. Through fresh insights and an unflinching examination of history, the story follows a chronological journey of a man who started as a doctor and ended as one of history's most reviled figures. Part 1. The Privileged Beginnings of Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the small Bavarian village of Günzburg, Germany. He was the eldest of three sons born to Karl and Walburga Mengele, a wealthy and influential family. His father, Karl, owned a prosperous machinery manufacturing business, Mengele & Sons, which provided Josef with a comfortable upbringing. The family's wealth and social status afforded him access to the best education and opportunities, shaping a privileged childhood that many in Germany at the time could only dream of. As a child, Mengele was known to be intelligent, ambitious, and highly disciplined. He excelled in school and displayed a keen interest in academics, particularly in the sciences. These qualities earned him admiration from his teachers and peers, reinforcing his sense of superiority and self-assurance. However, his privileged upbringing also cultivated a deep belief in hierarchy and order, values that would later align disturbingly well with Nazi ideology. Despite his academic success, he often struggled to connect emotionally with others, a trait that would come to define his clinical detachment in later years. After completing his early education, Mengele pursued higher studies, driven by an ambition to distinguish himself academically. In 1930, he enrolled at the University of Munich, where he studied philosophy and medicine. This was a period of great political and social upheaval in Germany. The Treaty of Versailles and the economic collapse of the 1920s had left the nation humiliated and searching for redemption. Young Germans like Mengele were particularly susceptible to the growing tide of nationalist sentiment sweeping the country. At university, Mengele's interest in anthropology deepened, and he became fascinated with the concept of racial purity, an ideology that would dominate his career and personal beliefs. In 1935, Mengele graduated with a PhD in anthropology from the University of Munich. His doctoral thesis focused on racial differences in the lower jaw, reflecting his growing obsession with the pseudo-scientific principles of eugenics. These studies would serve as the foundation for his future work, providing him with the intellectual justification for his actions at Auschwitz. By 1937, Mengele had joined the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt, working under Dr. Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a leading figure in the field of eugenics. Under Verschuer's mentorship, Mengele furthered his research on genetics, particularly on twins, which would later form the basis of his infamous experiments. It was during this period that Mengele became actively involved with the Nazi Party. In 1937, he formally joined the party and, shortly after, the Schutzstaffel, SS, aligning himself with the ideology of racial supremacy and Aryan dominance. For Mengele, the Nazi movement was not merely a political affiliation but an opportunity to elevate himself within a system that valued the very ideas he championed. His ambition and academic credentials made him a valuable asset to the regime, setting him on a trajectory toward positions of influence and authority. By 1940, Mengele's rise within the SS began to accelerate. He volunteered for military service and was assigned to the Waffen-SS, where he served as a medical officer. His early military service included time on the Eastern Front, where he was awarded the Iron Cross for bravery in combat. This recognition bolstered his reputation within the SS, earning him further opportunities for advancement. However, a severe injury in 1942 brought his frontline service to an end. This setback would unexpectedly pave the way for his transfer to a position that would cement his legacy of infamy: Auschwitz. Mengele's early life was a complex interplay of privilege, ambition, and ideological indoctrination. Born into comfort and gifted with intellect, he used these advantages to climb the academic and political ranks. Yet, beneath his success lay a chilling willingness to exploit science for inhumane purposes. His story was only beginning, and the path ahead would lead him to unimaginable horrors. Part 2. The Scholar of Eugenics. Josef Mengele's academic journey was marked by ambition and a disturbing fascination with eugenics, the pseudo-scientific belief in improving the genetic quality of a population through selective breeding. This ideology, widely embraced by Nazi Germany, provided Mengele with the intellectual framework for his future atrocities. His pursuit of academic excellence began in earnest at the University of Munich, where he studied medicine and philosophy. The political and social climate of the 1930s, combined with his academic interests, drew him closer to the racial ideologies espoused by the Nazi regime. Mengele's early academic work focused on physical anthropology and human genetics. In 1935, he earned a PhD in anthropology under the supervision of Theodore Mollison, a prominent anthropologist. His dissertation, titled Racial Morphological Research on the Lower Jaw Section of Four Racial Groups, exemplified his growing interest in racial classification. Though cloaked in scientific language, his research perpetuated the Nazi obsession with racial superiority and provided a veneer of legitimacy to their discriminatory policies. It was during this time that Mengele began to view science as a tool to serve ideological ends rather than a pursuit of truth. By 1937, Mengele's career took a significant turn when he joined the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. This institute, a hub for Nazi racial research, was led by Dr. Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a respected geneticist and one of the leading proponents of eugenics. Under Verschuer's guidance, Mengele focused on the study of hereditary traits, particularly in twins. This research would later form the basis for the gruesome experiments he conducted at Auschwitz. Verschuer's mentorship not only honed Mengele's scientific skills but also solidified his ideological commitment to the Nazi cause. Mengele's involvement in the Nazi Party grew deeper during this period. In 1937, he officially became a member of the Nazi Party, and shortly thereafter, he joined the SS. These affiliations were not merely symbolic. They demonstrated his willingness to align his scientific career with the goals of the regime. His academic achievements and ideological zeal made him an ideal candidate for positions of influence within the Nazi hierarchy. By combining his expertise in genetics with his political loyalty, Mengele positioned himself as a valuable asset to the Third Reich. The outbreak of World War II provided Mengele with new opportunities to advance his career. In 1940, he volunteered for service in the Waffen-SS, the military branch of the SS. Serving on the Eastern Front, Mengele was exposed to the brutal realities of war. During his time in the field, he conducted medical evaluations and treated soldiers, earning a reputation for his diligence and competence. In 1942, he was awarded the Iron Cross, Second Class, for his service. This recognition not only boosted his standing within the SS but also reinforced his sense of purpose and belief in the Nazi cause. However, an injury sustained on the Eastern Front in 1942 ended his frontline service. While recovering, Mengele was reassigned to a position that aligned more closely with his academic background and ideological convictions. He was appointed as a medical officer at the Race and Resettlement Office of the SS, where he conducted medical evaluations of individuals deemed suitable for the Nazi resettlement program. This role further deepened his involvement in the regime's eugenics-based policies, providing a bridge between his academic interests and the practical implementation of Nazi racial ideology. Mengele's academic journey was not merely a quest for knowledge. It was a deliberate effort to merge science with ideology. His work, shaped by mentors like Verschuer and the institutions of the Nazi state, laid the groundwork for his future atrocities. By the time he arrived at Auschwitz in 1943, Mengele had become a fully realized embodiment of the regime's darkest aspirations. His transition from scholar to perpetrator was complete, setting the stage for the horrors to come. Part 3. Joining the SS. Ideals turned to action. As the Nazi Party's influence grew, Josef Mengele found himself increasingly drawn to its radical ideals, seeking to translate his academic beliefs into action. While his early career was focused on the pursuit of knowledge, the rise of the Third Reich provided him with an ideological environment that resonated deeply with his growing sense of ambition. The notion of racial purity, already present in his academic work, now found a fertile ground within the Nazi movement, and Mengele saw the SS as the ideal platform to enact his theories. In 1937, at the age of 26, Mengele formally joined the Nazi Party, and shortly after, he enlisted in the Schutzstaffel, SS, the elite paramilitary organization tasked with enforcing Nazi ideology. For Mengele, this was not a mere political affiliation but a commitment to a cause he believed was both morally superior and scientifically justified. His academic background in anthropology, coupled with his enthusiasm for the Nazi racial agenda, made him a fitting candidate for the SS, which sought individuals who were both ideologically aligned and competent in their professional fields. Mengele's decision to join the SS was also motivated by personal ambition. The SS, which played a central role in enforcing the genocidal policies of the Third Reich, offered a rapid ascent for those who displayed loyalty and competence. Mengele quickly recognized that his scientific expertise could be utilized to further the SS racial policies, providing him with the opportunity to both gain power and put his studies into practice. His connection to Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, a prominent geneticist and key figure in the eugenics movement, also helped him gain favor within the SS, further securing his place within the organization. The transition from scholar to SS officer was seamless for Mengele. He soon found himself in a position of influence, serving as a medical officer with the SS Race and Resettlement Office, where he conducted medical evaluations of people selected for the Nazi resettlement program. Mengele's primary role was to assess individuals' suitability for forced relocation based on their perceived racial characteristics. This was the first step in Mengele's involvement with the systematic dehumanization that would later extend to the atrocities committed at Auschwitz. The SS racial ideology, which placed the so-called Aryan race at the top of the hierarchy, was now intertwined with Mengele's own scientific worldview. In 1940, Mengele's military service took him to the Eastern Front as part of the Waffen-SS, where he served as a medical officer. Here, he treated wounded soldiers, earning commendations for his professionalism. The experience allowed Mengele to further his association with the SS upper echelons, cementing his place within the organization. Despite the brutality of war, Mengele's focus remained on advancing his career, and he viewed his military service as another stepping stone to greater influence. However, by 1942, Mengele's service on the Eastern Front came to an abrupt end when he was injured during combat. This injury would turn out to be a turning point in his career. Rather than return to civilian life, Mengele was reassigned to a position that would alter the course of his life forever. In 1943, he was transferred to Auschwitz, one of the most notorious concentration camps in Nazi-occupied Europe. There, Mengele's role as a doctor would evolve into something far more sinister. His ability to justify his actions as scientifically driven, rooted in the very eugenic principles that had shaped his early academic career, would allow him to carry out horrific experiments on innocent victims, particularly twins, all while maintaining the facade of a committed professional. His joining the SS had transformed Mengele from a scholar into a key perpetrator in the Nazi genocide. Mengele's belief in the SS as a force of racial purification led him to justify his growing role in the Holocaust. His transition from ideologue to active participant was swift and terrifying, as the Nazi regime provided the ultimate validation for his academic interests, transforming his theories into the brutal reality of the death camps. Part 4. The Road to Auschwitz. A Path of No Return. In the spring of 1943, Josef Mengele's path took a decisive turn that would see him enter the infamous gates of Auschwitz, forever altering the course of history. His transfer to the concentration camp was not a random assignment but the result of both his personal ambition and the escalating demands of the Nazi regime for medical personnel who could serve their genocidal goals. Mengel's growing reputation as a highly trained doctor with expertise in anthropology and eugenics made him an ideal candidate for the role of camp physician at Auschwitz. However, his journey there marked the beginning of an irreversible descent into a nightmare of cruelty and horror. Auschwitz, located in German-occupied Poland, was the largest of the Nazi death camps. It was a place of systematic extermination, where millions of Jews, Romani people, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazis were sent to their deaths. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz during a time of increasing brutality and mass murder, when the Nazi regime was seeking to expand its efforts to cleanse Europe of Jews and other ethnic groups it deemed inferior. The camp had become the epicenter of the final solution. The Nazis planned to exterminate the Jewish people. Mengele's arrival in Auschwitz coincided with the implementation of the notorious selection process. Upon the arrival of a transport of prisoners, Mengele would stand at the camp's railway platforms, ready to choose who would live and who would die. This process, which became a regular part of his daily routine, was as much an exercise in cruelty as it was in efficiency. Mengele would examine the newly arrived prisoners, quickly determining who would be sent to the gas chambers and who would be used for forced labor or, more horrifically, for his experiments. His role in these selections would cement his place in the dark history of Auschwitz. Mengele's expertise in genetics and his obsession with racial purity made him invaluable to the SS at Auschwitz. He quickly earned the title of the Angel of Death due to his cold, clinical demeanor and his notorious decisions about who would be subjected to his twisted experiments. Yet Mengele's scientific interests were not rooted in medical ethics or compassion, but in his belief that the so-called inferior races could be genetically manipulated or eliminated to further the goals of the Nazi regime. His assignments at Auschwitz would quickly escalate from the routine selection of victims to the systematic torture of human beings in the name of eugenics. Auschwitz provided Mengele with the perfect laboratory for his disturbing experiments. Among the most infamous of his subjects were the twins. Mengele's obsession with twins had begun during his time at the Institute for Hereditary Biology, but it was at Auschwitz where his fixation would manifest in horrific experiments. He would often separate twins from their families upon arrival, isolating them in special barracks to conduct various cruel and invasive procedures. He injected them with unknown substances, performed surgeries without anesthesia, and subjected them to painful medical tests, all in the name of scientific research. His goal was to prove the superiority of the Aryan race by experimenting on those he considered to be genetically inferior. The suffering of these twins, many of whom died or were left permanently scarred, stands as one of the most brutal chapters of Mengele's time at Auschwitz. Mengele's cruelty extended beyond the twins to include other marginalized groups, such as Romani people, children, and the elderly. His experiments ranged from testing the effects of diseases like typhus and malaria to attempting to change eye color by injecting dye into the eyes of children. Each day at Auschwitz, Mengele's pursuit of pseudoscientific knowledge led him to subject more victims to inhumane treatment, all while maintaining a facade of professionalism. His actions were not only sanctioned by the Nazi regime, but were seen as vital to their racial purification goals. Mengele's time at Auschwitz marked the culmination of his ideological beliefs and his academic interests. The camp became his laboratory, where he could put into practice the eugenic theories that had shaped his life. His work, fueled by a belief in racial hierarchy and scientific supremacy, became an integral part of the atrocities that were unfolding on a daily basis. Auschwitz was no longer merely a death camp. It had become the place where Mengele's warped ideas about race and genetics were put into action, with devastating consequences. By the time the Allies began to liberate the camps in 1945, Mengele's legacy at Auschwitz had already been sealed. His experiments and selections had claimed the lives of thousands, leaving behind a trail of horror that would reverberate for generations. The road to Auschwitz, once a path of ideological certainty and scientific zeal, had led Mengele to a place of unimaginable human suffering. His journey was far from over, however. The end of the war would mark the beginning of his efforts to escape accountability for his crimes. Part 5: Life or Death. Mengele's decisions at Auschwitz. Josef Mengele's role at Auschwitz was not confined to just selecting who would be sent to the gas chambers and who would be spared for forced labor. It was a position that granted him the power to decide life or death on an almost daily basis. His decisions, often based on superficial criteria such as age, health, or racial purity, were made without remorse or empathy, reflecting the dehumanizing ideology of the Nazi regime. As a camp doctor, Mengele became one of the key figures responsible for the relentless extermination process, contributing to the systematic murder of countless victims. Each transport of prisoners that arrived at Auschwitz was met with the same brutal process. The selections. Mengele, alongside other SS officers, would stand in front of the newly arrived prisoners, often crowded in horrific conditions, and make life-altering decisions within seconds. Those deemed unfit, such as the elderly, the sick, or young children, were sent directly to the gas chambers. The others, those deemed fit for labor, were subjected to grueling conditions that would often lead to their deaths through exhaustion, starvation, or disease. Mengele's choices were governed by the same twisted ideology that had shaped the entire Nazi system: a belief in racial purity and a view of certain groups of people as expendable or inferior. The prisoners who were selected to live, while spared from immediate death, were not guaranteed survival. Many were forced to endure the horrors of the labor camps, where they worked under inhumane conditions, or became the subjects of Mengele's infamous experiments. Those chosen for Mengele's studies often faced far worse fates than those sent to the gas chambers. In his mind, Mengele was conducting research, although this research had no scientific basis, and was instead an exercise in cruelty masked by pseudoscience. His subjects were often subjected to unthinkable horrors, including forced sterilizations, mutilations, and painful medical procedures designed to test his theories about racial superiority. Mengele's victims had no agency in these experiments, and their suffering was immense. Despite the unimaginable pain inflicted upon them, Mengele remained detached, focusing solely on the supposed scientific value of his work, viewing the human beings he tormented as mere specimens. Many of those chosen for these experiments were subjected to grueling and invasive procedures, often without anesthesia. Some were forced to endure surgery, while others were injected with deadly pathogens such as tuberculosis or malaria. His twin experiments were particularly notorious, as Mengele believed that twins could provide insight into genetic similarities and differences. He would often separate twins from their families upon arrival, isolating them in special barracks before subjecting them to inhumane experiments. The fate of these twins often resulted in death or lifelong suffering, as Mengele's obsession with perfecting his theories took precedence over any semblance of medical ethics. Despite the growing awareness of the atrocities taking place at Auschwitz, Mengele's role in the camp remained largely unchallenged for a long period of time. His decisions continued to be made with the full backing of the Nazi regime, who valued his contributions to the scientific aspects of their racial policies. Mengele's position in the SS ensured his relative safety, even as the death toll continued to rise and the horrors of the Holocaust reached their peak. For Mengele, the boundary between life and death became increasingly blurred. He did not see himself as a murderer, but rather as a scientist conducting necessary experiments, driven by an ideology that justified the suffering of millions. However, for the victims, each day in the camp was a desperate struggle for survival, where the distinction between life and death was often determined by mere chance or the whim of a man like Mengele. As the war progressed, Mengele's involvement in the daily operations of Auschwitz continued to solidify his role as a central figure in the Holocaust. His influence over life and death, however, would not go unchallenged forever. As the Allied forces advanced, and the Nazis began to lose ground, the horrors of Auschwitz were exposed to the outside world. But for Mengele, the end of the war did not mean an end to his quest for power or his desire to escape justice. Part 6. Twins of Terror. Mengele's Cruel Experiments. Among the most harrowing and infamous aspects of Josef Mengele's tenure at Auschwitz were his brutal experiments on twins, a twisted obsession that grew from his academic interests in genetics and hereditary biology. Mengele's fascination with twins began long before he arrived at the camp, and by the time he became a medical officer at Auschwitz, he had found the perfect opportunity to carry out his horrific research. His experiments on twins were rooted in his desire to understand genetic similarities and differences, particularly in an effort to prove the Nazi regime's racial ideology that the Aryan race was superior to all others. The twins, who were often separated from their families upon arrival at Auschwitz, were treated like lab rats, isolated in special barracks where they were subjected to unthinkable experiments. Mengele saw these innocent children as mere tools for his pseudo-scientific endeavors, disregarding their humanity in the pursuit of his twisted goals. His obsession with twins was driven by a belief that studying them could unlock the key to understanding racial purity and perfection. Upon arrival, The twins were usually selected for Mengel's experiments based on their physical appearance, with preference given to those who were identical. Mengel's experiments on twins were varied and horrific, ranging from injections of deadly substances to forced surgeries, all designed to test his theories about genetics and racial traits. In many cases, the twins were subjected to painful and invasive procedures, often without any form of anesthesia. They were injected with harmful substances to induce disease, while others were subjected to surgeries where organs were removed or altered in a brutal attempt to study the body's response. In some of Mengel's experiments, he sought to change the eye color of the children by injecting dye directly into their eyes. Many of the children were permanently blinded as a result, their once bright futures destroyed in an instant. Mengele also conducted gruesome experiments in an attempt to prove the superiority of the Aryan race, subjecting the children to mutilations that left them scarred for life. The suffering of these twins went largely unnoticed by the outside world during the war, but their pain was immeasurable. Mengele's sadistic behavior and his obsession with perfecting his experiments often led to his victims being killed or left to suffer permanent injuries. Many of the twins died from the effects of these experiments, while others were so severely disfigured or damaged that they would carry the scars of Mengele's cruelty for the rest of their lives. Mengele's actions were not isolated. They were part of a larger, coordinated effort by the Nazis to purify the human race, with eugenics at the heart of their philosophy. His experiments on twins were just one example of the countless atrocities he carried out under the guise of scientific research. His work in the concentration camp was an attempt to provide scientific legitimacy to the Nazi regime's inhumane racial policies. Mengele viewed his actions as part of a noble cause, a belief that justified his horrific behavior and blinded him to the suffering of his victims. However, the reality of Mengele's experiments on twins was far from the sterile laboratory setting he likely envisioned. The children he experimented on were subjected to unimaginable pain and suffering, often dying in agony as a result of Mengele's cruelty. These experiments were not only unethical but outright barbaric, a grotesque distortion of science that placed human lives below ideological goals. While Mengele's experiments were largely hidden from the outside world during the war, the survivors of Auschwitz would later share their stories, revealing the true extent of the horror inflicted upon them. The twins who survived Mengele's horrific experiments would never forget the atrocities they endured. Some would live with the physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives, their memories of the camp and the cruelty of Mengele haunting them long after the war's end. Mengele's legacy as the Angel of Death was cemented through his twin experiments, as well as his larger role in the systematic genocide of millions of innocent people. The atrocities he committed under the guise of scientific research remain some of the darkest moments in human history. His pursuit of knowledge, driven by a belief in racial superiority, cost countless lives and left a scar on humanity that can never be erased. Part 7. Voices of Survival. Testimonies from Mengele's victims. The voices of those who survived the horrors of Auschwitz, particularly under the brutal hands of Josef Mengele, hold immense weight, reminders of the atrocities that took place during the Holocaust. These survivors, who witnessed the horrors of Mengele's selection process and suffered through his grotesque experiments, offer a rare and invaluable window into the darkness of those times. Their stories are not just a recounting of events, but living testaments to the strength of the human spirit, enduring unimaginable suffering and holding on to the hope of survival. Eva Moses Kor's voice stands out as one of the most powerful. Her account of being one of Mengele's twins is both heart-wrenching and enlightening. "I didn't understand why," she recalls, her voice breaking as she describes the day Mengele selected her and her sister Miriam. "He didn't care about us. We were just subjects in his sick experiment." For Eva, the nightmare began in that moment, and it never truly ended. Mengele's infamous elections were brutal. The survivors recall the constant threat of death looming over them, as they were separated from their families with no explanation. "It felt like a lottery," says another survivor, Itzhak Stern, who recalls being spared by mere chance. "You never knew if you were lucky or unlucky, if you'd be taken to the gas chambers or forced into Mengele's lab for another one of his twisted tests." The randomness of survival made the experience even more unbearable. The twins, who were often subjected to Mengele's cruel experiments, suffered in ways that words cannot capture. Day after day, they were injected with unknown substances, subjected to surgeries without anesthesia, and forced to endure pain that would scar them for life. For many, this trauma remained long after the war's end, with survivors struggling to make sense of their suffering, often turning to advocacy and education to keep the memory of what happened alive. "I don't remember what I felt when it was happening. You had to shut off your emotions to survive," recalls one survivor. "But after it was over, the pain, the memories, they never left. I lived through it, but I never left it behind." These words echo the sentiment shared by so many who survived Mengel's experiments. Survival did not mean freedom from the scars, both physical and psychological. One of the most striking aspects of these survivors' testimonies is their resilience and determination to reclaim their narratives. Eva Moses Kor, despite the unimaginable suffering, became one of the foremost voices in Holocaust education, sharing her story with the world. "I survived not just to live," she says, "but to make sure the world remembers what Mengele did to us." This powerful statement encapsulates the courage these survivors exhibited, not just in surviving the camps, but in their post-war lives, where they found meaning in telling their stories. For many, these survivors' testimonies are not just a window into the past but a vital reminder of the importance of remembrance. One survivor recalls, "We tell our stories not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will never know what it was like, so they don't forget the lessons of the past." Through their voices, these survivors ensure that the horrors they endured will never fade from history. The survivors' experiences provide vital lessons about the depths of human cruelty and the lengths to which the human spirit can endure. They speak not only of Mengele's atrocities but of the universal need to confront hatred, prejudice, and inhumanity in all its forms. In their words, we find not just the testimony of suffering, but the enduring strength of the human will to survive and to seek justice. By listening to their testimonies, we are reminded that these voices must never be silenced. Their courage, despite everything they went through, is the ultimate rebuke to the horrors of Mengele's experiments. These survivors are more than just victims. They are warriors, carrying the lessons of their painful pasts into a world that desperately needs them to speak. Their stories are a call to action, to preserve memory, to fight against indifference, and to honor those whose lives were stolen by Mengele's experiments. Part 8. The Collapse of the Reich, Mengele's Escape. As the Third Reich crumbled under the relentless advance of Allied forces, Josef Mengele's position as a key figure within the Nazi regime was rapidly becoming untenable. By the spring of 1945, the Allies were closing in on Berlin, and the concentration camps, including Auschwitz, were being liberated one by one. Mengele, aware that the fall of the Reich would spell certain doom for those who had orchestrated its darkest deeds, was faced with a choice: remain in Germany and risk capture or flee to safety. The collapse of Nazi power was swift and catastrophic, and many top officials, including Mengele, began to make their escape as the Allies pushed forward. Mengele had managed to maintain his position of authority and fear within the Auschwitz complex for years. But now, with the camp's liberation imminent, his grip on power was slipping. In the chaos of the final days of the war, Mengele chose to flee, leaving behind the horrors he had so cruelly orchestrated and stepping into a new world of uncertainty. His escape was aided by the confusion of the closing days of the war. As Soviet and American troops advanced, Nazi officials scrambled to avoid capture, and Mengele, ever the opportunist, used his position to slip through the cracks. He took advantage of the disarray to escape from Auschwitz, traveling through war-torn Europe under various false identities. Mengele's first destination was Bavaria, where he hid in the rural countryside, relying on the network of Nazi sympathizers and former SS officers who had been loyal to him during the war. The same network that had shielded him from prosecution now worked in secret to protect him, providing him with the means to stay hidden from Allied forces. Mengele knew that his time in Germany was running out. His reputation had preceded him, and the walls were closing in. Despite his attempts to flee, Mengele was not entirely beyond the reach of justice. In fact, there were those who were already searching for him, driven by a desire to hold him accountable for the suffering he had caused. But Mengele, always calculating and cold, managed to stay one step ahead, evading capture at every turn. His first brush with justice came when he was briefly detained by American forces, but, as with so many other high-ranking Nazis, he was released due to confusion and misidentification. This lucky escape further cemented Mengele's reputation for surviving even the most dangerous situations. The final months of the war were chaotic for everyone, but for Mengele, they were a time of uncertainty and fear of being found and arrested. As the Allies closed in, Mengel's former colleagues began to scatter, and he found himself alone and hunted, yet still firmly clinging to the belief that he could escape justice. The Reich had fallen, but the horrors Mengele had enacted were far from over. His escape would set the stage for years of evasion and hiding. Mengele's escape represented more than just the survival of one man. It symbolized the failure of the post-war world to bring all Nazi criminals to justice. As the world began to rebuild after the devastation of war, some perpetrators, like Mengele, slipped through the cracks, evading capture and leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions. His flight from Europe marked the beginning of his years in hiding. Years spent in the shadows, free from prosecution, yet forever haunted by the ghosts of his past crimes. Part 9. A Fugitive in Chaos. Post-war Europe. As the war ended, Europe found itself in a state of utter disarray, with millions of people displaced, cities in ruins, and entire nations trying to rebuild from the ashes of Nazi occupation. The remnants of the Nazi regime were shattered, but for those who had been part of its brutal machinery, the end of the war did not bring an end to their fears. Josef Mengele, now a fugitive, found himself amid this chaotic world, with the fall of the Reich having left him vulnerable but not yet defeated. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Europe was a melting pot of uncertainty and shifting allegiances. With borders redrawn, populations scattered, and the world recovering from the horrors of the Holocaust, Mengele's position as a wanted war criminal was precarious. But he still had a network of former Nazi officials, physicians, and sympathizers who aided in his survival. For Mengele, the fear of capture was ever present. Yet the chaos of post-war Europe provided a convenient cover for his fugitive status. He took refuge in the rural regions of southern Germany, where he sought safety among a network of Nazis who were equally desperate to escape the watchful eyes of the Allies. Many of these individuals were former SS members, physicians, and bureaucrats who had supported Mengele's work at Auschwitz or had been part of the Nazi apparatus itself. The dark web of post-war Nazi sympathizers, still intact despite the collapse of the Reich, enabled Mengele to evade detection by providing him with false documentation, hiding places, and safe houses across Germany and Austria. However, his time in hiding would not be without its complications. Mengele was increasingly paranoid and terrified of being discovered, knowing that with every passing day, the world grew closer to uncovering his whereabouts. He feared not just capture, but also the possibility of the gruesome justice his crimes deserved. As Allied forces began their investigations into Nazi war crimes, Mengele's name rose to the surface, and numerous attempts were made to track him down. Yet, in the confusion and disarray, many were still unaware of his exact role in the atrocities at Auschwitz, and he managed to slip through the cracks time and again. During this period, Mengele's life was fraught with uncertainty. His every movement was calculated, his identity constantly changing, and his existence a precarious balancing act between survival and the constant threat of exposure. His ability to evade capture was not only a testament to his cunning but also to the fractured state of post-war Europe, where the sheer number of displaced persons, the chaos of the occupation zones, and the sheer difficulty in tracking down high-ranking Nazis worked in his favor. It wasn't just the lack of organization that helped Mengele. The international powers were distracted with the growing Cold War, which quickly became the main focus of European geopolitics. As the world's attention shifted to the looming ideological battle between the Soviet Union and the United States, Mengele, along with other Nazi fugitives, found a brief window of opportunity to disappear into the chaos of a divided Europe. Despite the fact that Mengele was now officially one of the most wanted men in the world, his post-war life was one of hiding in plain sight. He traveled extensively within Europe, always under a false identity, relying on his former Nazi connections and the fractured post-war landscape to ensure his safety. For years, Mengele's fate seemed uncertain, and his name would not resurface until many years later. In the fog of post-war Europe, Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, became a ghost, a fugitive who evaded capture for decades. While the world was slowly turning its gaze toward justice for the millions lost to Nazi terror, Mengele was desperately holding on to his freedom, knowing that time was his enemy, but perhaps also his greatest ally. Part 10. South America. A killer in hiding. By the late 1940s, Josef Mengele's flight from Europe had brought him across oceans and continents, leading him to South America, a region that would become the final refuge for many high-ranking Nazi officials, including Mengele himself. The post-war chaos in Europe had been a temporary cover, but as the hunt for war criminals intensified, Mengele knew he had to disappear permanently if he was to avoid justice. South America, with its extensive networks of former Nazis and sympathizers, became his new sanctuary. Mengele's escape to South America was not without challenges, but the climate of secrecy that surrounded him made it possible for him to establish new lives in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. At the time, many of these nations were sympathetic to the plight of former Nazis, and some even welcomed them with open arms, offering them protection from prosecution. As a result, Mengele found a place where he could quietly settle, free from the constant threat of capture. Argentina, under the leadership of President Juan Perón, was a particularly popular destination for Nazi war criminals, as Perón's government offered sanctuary to fascist figures in exchange for their skills and expertise. Mengele arrived in Buenos Aires around 1949, where he assumed a new identity and began to live among the local German-speaking community. In Argentina, Mengele was far from the infamous angel of death he had been in Auschwitz. Here, he was just another immigrant trying to rebuild a life. But beneath this facade, his past would continue to haunt him, and his sense of guilt and paranoia would never truly fade. Mengele's life in South America was marked by a constant fear of being discovered. He continued to live under various aliases, changing his name repeatedly, but always within reach of those who shared his ideology. He eventually moved to Brazil, where he settled in a remote area, hiding in the shadows of small communities that were not aware of the man's dark past. It was here that Mengele would try to build a new life, free from the fear of Allied soldiers and the eyes of the world. However, as much as he tried to escape, Mengele's history could not be erased. In the relative isolation of South America, Mengele's actions caught up with him in a different way. The psychological toll of his past was unrelenting. 4 years, he had lived without confronting the atrocities he had committed, but the emotional and mental burden of his role in the deaths of so many would weigh on him during these final years. He never fully reconciled with what he had done, and despite living in the shadows, he knew that justice was closing in on him, even if he could not see it. Though Mengele's life in South America allowed him to evade justice for a time, it would not last forever. In the late 1950s and 1960s, international efforts to find and bring Nazi war criminals to trial intensified. Mengele's name had been circulating in intelligence circles, but the fugitive was still protected by the network of Nazi sympathizers who had helped him flee Europe. Despite the growing awareness of his whereabouts, Mengele continued to move through South America, knowing that his freedom was a fragile thing. In 1960, after an investigation led by the Israeli Mossad brought Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal's pursuit of war criminals to the global stage, Mengele's past was finally starting to catch up with him. But for the time being, Mengele remained just out of reach, an ever-elusive figure in the heart of South America, continuing to live the life of a man forever haunted by the ghosts of his past. Mengele's years in South America, while providing him with some temporary peace, were ultimately filled with the tension of living in constant hiding, his every step shadowed by the fear of discovery. The world was starting to remember him, and it was only a matter of time before he would be forced to confront the atrocities of his past. His time in South America would soon come to an end, but for now, Josef Mengele remained a fugitive, slipping through the cracks of a continent that, for a time, became his final refuge. Part 11. The Nazi Hunters. Pursuit of Justice. As the decades passed, the world's pursuit of justice for the horrors committed during the Holocaust intensified. The survivors' voices grew louder, and a global movement began to gather momentum, one focused on bringing Nazi war criminals to justice, no matter how long it took. The quest to capture those responsible for the atrocities, including Josef Mengele, was no longer just the work of individual nations or war tribunals. It was now a global cause. The legacy of the Holocaust and the survivors' demands for accountability made it clear that Mengele and others like him could not simply vanish into obscurity. The rise of what became known as the Nazi Hunters, a network of passionate and dedicated individuals and organizations, played a crucial role in the search for war criminals like Mengele. One of the most famous figures in this hunt was Simon Wiesenthal, an Austrian Jewish Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life to tracking down Nazis and bringing them to justice. Wiesenthal's determination to locate and expose the Nazis who had escaped justice was unwavering, and his efforts spanned decades. He worked tirelessly to compile information on war criminals, including Mengele, even as the latter continued to evade capture. Wiesenthal's personal journey, driven by a profound sense of justice and moral duty, was deeply rooted in the traumatic losses he had experienced during the Holocaust. His life's mission to locate and bring former Nazis to trial became an obsession, fueled by the belief that the pursuit of justice was not just about accountability but also about preserving the memory of the millions who had perished. Wiesenthal and his colleagues painstakingly tracked down leads, collecting information from survivors, witnesses, and former Nazi officials, and sharing this vital data with international organizations such as the Mossad and the West German authorities. Meanwhile, other organizations, including the Simon Wiesenthal Center, also took part in the global hunt for Nazis. The Mossad, Israel's secret intelligence service, was another key player in this pursuit. In the 1960s, Mossad's involvement in capturing Adolf Eichmann, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, demonstrated that Israel would go to great lengths to ensure that justice was served, and Mengel's case was one of the next on the list. The hunt for Mengele became a significant operation, with a coalition of international agents working together to find and capture the fugitive physician. Despite the tireless efforts of Nazi hunters, Mengele's elusive nature proved to be a formidable obstacle. His years of evading capture and his extensive network of former Nazi sympathizers allowed him to remain hidden in South America for years. He frequently changed his identity and moved from one place to another, always aware that he was being hunted. Mengele's survival was a testament not only to his cunning but also to the chaotic environment of post-war Europe and the relative lack of coordinated efforts to track him down in his early years on the run. While Mengele's whereabouts remained a mystery, the work of the Nazi hunters continued unabated. The survivors, many of whom had never forgotten Mengele's face or the atrocities he had committed, provided invaluable information that helped fuel the search. It was their testimonies and their unyielding demand for justice that kept the hunt alive, and with each passing year, the global pressure on Mengele grew stronger. The hunt for Mengele was as much about confronting history and the moral imperative of justice as it was about finding a man who had evaded capture for so long. The Nazi hunters became symbols of hope, reminding the world that even the most heinous criminals could not escape the long arm of justice forever. But the question remained, would Mengele ever be brought to trial for his crimes, or would he continue to live as a ghost in the shadows, his name forever tied to the horror of Auschwitz? Part 12. Justice Denied. Why Mengele was never caught. Despite the tireless efforts of Nazi hunters, government agencies, and countless individuals determined to bring him to justice, Josef Mengele's capture never came to fruition. For decades, he lived as a fugitive, evading law enforcement and continuing to live a life in the shadows. But the question remains, why was he never caught? Why was one of the most infamous war criminals of the 20th century allowed to slip through the cracks for so long? One of the primary reasons for Mengele's elusiveness was the vast network of support he had cultivated during and after the war. This network included Nazi sympathizers, former SS officers, and other war criminals who had escaped prosecution and were living in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. These connections provided Mengele with the resources to move, hide, and change his identity whenever necessary, keeping him one step ahead of his pursuers. Without this network, his chances of evading capture would have been drastically reduced. In addition to these networks, the geopolitical climate of the post-war period worked in Mengele's favor. As the Cold War unfolded, the international community's focus shifted from tracking down Nazi war criminals to the emerging conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Many Western nations, including the United States, were willing to overlook the presence of former Nazis in their ranks if it meant gaining intelligence about Soviet activities. The presence of Nazis in South America was tolerated, and in some cases even encouraged, as both the US and Soviet Union recruited former Nazis for their own intelligence operations. Mengele, among others, benefited from this atmosphere of political expediency, as his capture was no longer a top priority for some governments. Another significant obstacle was the lack of resources and coordination between various agencies. The hunt for war criminals was often fragmented, with different countries operating independently and focusing on their own priorities. Despite the efforts of organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Mossad, resources for tracking down Mengele were limited. The lack of a unified global effort to find him meant that many leads went unpursued, and the search often lacked the momentum it needed to succeed. Mengele's own ability to stay under the radar played a pivotal role in his continued evasion. He was highly intelligent and cautious, always aware of his surroundings and quick to change his location whenever danger loomed. His use of false identities, along with his ability to blend in among the German-speaking communities of South America, made him virtually invisible. He was, in many ways, a master of disguise, hiding in plain sight for years, as his name and face faded from public memory. Furthermore, the lack of concrete evidence regarding Mengele's whereabouts made it difficult for authorities to act on any leads. Though his name was well known and his crimes infamous, concrete proof of his location remained elusive for decades. The few times that his presence in South America was suspected, the search was either hindered by lack of access to certain areas or miscommunication between international law enforcement agencies. Even more disheartening was the fact that Mengele's victims, who had survived the horrors of Auschwitz, could not see justice for the crimes he had committed against them. Many survivors lived their lives haunted by the trauma of their experiences, while the man who had caused so much suffering continued to evade justice. This was perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, that the legacy of the Holocaust, the immense suffering and loss, would never be fully confronted while Mengele remained free. Mengele's evasion of justice is a stark reminder of the difficulty of holding war criminals accountable, especially when they have the means and support to hide, and when global priorities are shifting or distracted. It highlights the limitations of justice in the face of powerful networks, complex geopolitics, and the dark realities of post-war recovery. Though Mengele would never face trial, his legacy remains a reminder of the horrific crimes committed during the Holocaust. His name, synonymous with the atrocities at Auschwitz, will forever echo through history, a symbol of the evils that went unchecked for so long. Though he escaped justice in life, his name has lived on, ensuring that, in the end, justice was never entirely denied. Part 13. Death in Exile. Mengele's Final Years. Josef Mengele's years in hiding, evading justice and living under a series of false identities came to a quiet and largely unnoticed end in 1979. Despite his efforts to remain a ghost, Mengele could not escape the passage of time, and his final years were marked by isolation, declining health, and the relentless ghosts of his past. His once vibrant life had transformed into an existence of secrecy and paranoia, as the shadows of his crimes loomed over him until the very end. After years of moving from one place to another, Mengele found himself in Brazil, where he had lived for several years in relative obscurity. By this time, his health had begun to deteriorate, a consequence of the years spent living in fear and the toll his conscience had taken on him. He had suffered several strokes and was living in a small community near São Paulo, living under the name of Wolfgang Gerhard, and had settled into a life marked by solitude and regret. Mengele's days were spent largely alone, without the company of friends or family, as the weight of his past continued to haunt him. He was aware of the growing international interest in his whereabouts, as the pursuit of justice for his crimes intensified in the 1970s. But even in his final years, Mengele remained elusive, his isolation serving as a protection from those who sought to hold him accountable. In February of 1979, Mengele's life took a dramatic turn when he suffered a fatal stroke while swimming in a pool near his home. Alone at the time, he drowned in the water, and his death went unnoticed for several days. It was only after an investigation, prompted by the discovery of his body, that his true identity was revealed. The revelation of Mengele's death in 1979 marked the end of a long chapter of evasion and secrecy. The world had been denied the satisfaction of seeing him tried and convicted for his war crimes, but his death, in many ways, was the final victory of the victims who had long sought justice. Mengele had lived for decades with the knowledge that the world was looking for him, and despite his ability to elude capture, he could never escape the weight of his actions. Though his death in Brazil ended the search for him, it did not mark the end of the quest for justice. The investigation into Mengele's life and crimes continued after his death, as his story remained a point of profound significance for historians, survivors, and future generations. The question of whether he had ever fully acknowledged the horror of his actions remained unanswered, as Mengele had been silent on the subject of his crimes until the very end. In the aftermath of Mengele's death, his remains were eventually exhumed in the late 1980s, and through DNA testing, his identity was conclusively confirmed. The results of the tests confirmed what many had suspected. Josef Mengele had indeed died in exile, a fugitive to the very end. His remains were buried in Brazil, far from the world that had once known him as the Angel of Death. Mengele's death in exile serves as a bitter reminder of the complexities of seeking justice after a crime of such magnitude. Despite his elusive nature and the decades spent in hiding, Mengel's death did little to erase the scars of the Holocaust, which continued to be felt by the survivors and their families. He had never been held accountable in the way that many had hoped, but his death, unremarkable, quiet, and isolated, was a fitting end for a man who had lived his life running from the consequences of his actions. Though Mengele escaped the tribunals and trials that others faced, his legacy remains one of horror and infamy. His crimes cannot be erased by time or by death, and the world will forever remember the evil that he committed. The fight for justice, while never fully realized in Mengele's case, left an indelible mark on history, reminding us of the importance of holding those who commit atrocities accountable, no matter where they hide. Part 14. Uncovering the Truth. Posthumous Investigations. Though Josef Mengele's death marked the end of his life as a fugitive, it did not put an end to the questions, investigations, and revelations surrounding his crimes. Instead, his death in 1979 acted as a catalyst for renewed efforts to uncover the full scope of his atrocities and hold the memory of his victims in the public conscience. Posthumous investigations into Mengele's life shed light on how he managed to evade capture, the extent of his crimes at Auschwitz, and the complicity of those who had helped him remain in hiding. In the years following his death, governments and organizations worked to verify the true identity of the man who had been hiding in Brazil. In 1985, his unmarked grave in São Paulo was exhumed, and his remains were subjected to advanced forensic testing. Forensic scientists meticulously analyzed his skeletal structure and dental records, ultimately confirming that the man buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard was indeed Josef Mengele. This definitive conclusion closed one chapter of uncertainty but opened new ones about the mechanisms of his escape. The investigations revealed that Mengele's survival and elusiveness were largely due to the intricate network of Nazi sympathizers and collaborators that flourished after World War II. Countries like Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil had provided safe havens for war criminals, offering them new identities and protection in exchange for loyalty or financial contributions. Mengele had benefited from these networks, relying on their resources to move between countries and evade law enforcement. Documents uncovered in the investigations revealed the complicity of certain governments, which had either ignored or actively suppressed efforts to capture him. Moreover, posthumous inquiries unearthed new information about Mengele's role in the experiments at Auschwitz. Testimonies from survivors, combined with the discovery of documents that detailed his medical research, painted an even grimmer picture of the horrors he had inflicted. These experiments, often conducted under the guise of scientific advancement, were nothing more than brutal torture inflicted on innocent victims. The investigations brought these atrocities to the forefront, ensuring that the full extent of his crimes would not be forgotten. The pursuit of truth also extended to Mengele's personal writings, which were discovered after his death. Diaries and letters recovered from his belongings revealed a man who expressed no remorse for his actions. In these documents, Mengele justified his experiments as scientific necessity, showcasing a chilling lack of empathy. His writings offered a rare glimpse into the mind of a man whose work had caused unimaginable suffering and whose ideology had driven him to commit such heinous acts. The revelations that emerged from these investigations reignited public interest in the Holocaust and the need to preserve its memory. Survivors of Mengele's experiments were given a platform to share their stories, ensuring that their voices would be heard and their experiences would not be overshadowed by his death. Memorials and documentaries about Mengele and his victims proliferated, serving as powerful reminders of the consequences of unchecked hate and prejudice. The posthumous investigations into Mengele's life and crimes were about more than just uncovering facts. They were about confronting the past and ensuring that the lessons of history would not be forgotten. They demonstrated the importance of accountability, even after death, and underscored the resilience of those who sought justice in the face of insurmountable odds. Mengele's death may have denied the world a trial, but the pursuit of truth ensured that his legacy would remain one of infamy. By uncovering the truth, historians and survivors reclaimed the narrative from the man who had tried to evade justice, ensuring that the world would never forget the horrors he had perpetrated. Part 15. Lessons of Evil. Remembering Mengele's Victims. As the story of Josef Mengele comes to an end, what remains is a vital obligation to remember the lives lost and the suffering endured at his hands. The lessons drawn from his reign of terror at Auschwitz and his subsequent escape from justice serve as stark reminders of the consequences of unchecked hatred, prejudice, and moral corruption. The enduring legacy of Mengele is not his name, but the resilience of his victims and the lessons their stories impart to future generations. For the survivors of Mengele's experiments, life after liberation was a testament to human strength and perseverance. Despite the unimaginable pain they had endured, many dedicated themselves to ensuring that the world would never forget. They spoke out, wrote memoirs, and participated in documentaries that brought the horrors of the Holocaust into sharp focus for generations who had not lived through it. Their voices became the moral compass guiding humanity toward remembrance and accountability. The atrocities committed by Mengele are inseparable from the broader history of the Holocaust. His experiments, carried out in the name of pseudoscience, represent the depths of human cruelty when ideology supplants empathy. The systematic dehumanization of individuals, the pursuit of racial purity, and the unchecked power given to individuals like Mengele are warnings to prevent history from repeating itself. The memorials at Auschwitz and other Holocaust sites stand as somber reminders of these lessons. In the decades since Mengele's death, the global commitment to remembering his crimes has only grown. Educational initiatives around the Holocaust have expanded, ensuring that students and adults alike understand the horrors of this dark chapter in history. Museums, such as Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, have curated exhibits that highlight the stories of victims and survivors, keeping their memories alive. These efforts are not only about mourning the past but also about shaping a better future. The lessons of Mengele's evil extend beyond the Holocaust, serving as a warning against the dangers of unbridled power and the dehumanization of others. Injustice and hate, when left unchallenged, can give rise to atrocities on a massive scale. Mengele's story, and the suffering he caused, emphasize the need for vigilance in combating discrimination, bigotry, and the abuse of science. These lessons resonate far beyond his time, offering insights into the human condition and the fragile balance of morality. Moreover, the failure to bring Mengele to justice highlights the complexities of international accountability and the need for better global mechanisms to prevent impunity. His escape from trial, while deeply painful for survivors and their families, underscored the importance of pursuing justice even decades after crimes have been committed. The relentless efforts of Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal, along with the work of historians and journalists, ensured that Mengele's story would remain in the public consciousness. Remembering Mengele's victims is a call to action for future generations. Their suffering was not in vain, as their stories inspire a commitment to justice, empathy, and the protection of human dignity. Their resilience stands as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable evil, the human spirit can endure and prevail. The world must honor their memory by fostering a culture of understanding, accountability, and compassion. As this documentary concludes, the legacy of Josef Mengele is one of infamy, but the enduring legacy of his victims is one of courage. The lessons of evil remind us that the past is never truly behind us, and that the fight for justice and humanity is ongoing. By remembering the victims and their stories, the world ensures that their voices will never be silenced, and their pain will not be forgotten. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.